Rambam Sefer Misvot Aseh, positive commandment. We're up to number Kuf Chafeh, number 125, talking about the various Misvot of a person's obligation to give from his field and his produce. We named 5 Misvot in a row of that which one leaves for the poor. Lekesh Hao Pe'ah, Olelot, and Peret, which is the equivalent with grapes to the produce Misvah. Then we spoke about a specific Misvah of when separates, not just leaves to others, but separates parts of his and brings specifically to Yerushalayim, to the Kohen, and that's called the Bikurim, the first of his produce of a specific species. And that brings us to a series of other Misvot in that same realm of separate obligations of separation of parts or percentages of your produce and giving them to other parties. Misvah Kov Chavhen number 125. Yishesivanu Luhosia. I'm sorry, we did that one. Kov Chavav 126. Yishesivanu Luhosi Teruma Gedola. So we have a Misvah to separate something called Teruma. And he's calling it, the Rambam is calling it Teruma Gedola, because there's another Misvah that we'll see soon that's also called Teruma. So to differentiate, Hachamim adopted this term for, let's call, normative Teruma, and they call it the great Teruma, Teruma Gedola. The source in the Torah is Reshit Dechanecha Teten Lo. The first of your produce, literally that means your grain, you shall give to him. Him being the Kohen, and really from the Torah, the word Reshit captures it all. In other words, there is no percentage specification of what you have to allot to the Kohen from the as the first separation of your produce, and it could be anything at all, kol shehu. But Hachamim gave 3 levels: someone who is who's giving, someone who's a Benoni, average, someone who's cheap guy, either a 40th, a 50th, or a 60th. So the average is a 50th, which is 2%. So we usually talk in terms of 2%. It's only in Israel Misvah. It's still in play in Eretz Yisrael, although we don't give it to the Kohen anymore these days. And there has this Misvah, its own Masechet, and said that Zera'im called Teruma, and that's where you can find these halachot. Misvah Kov Kav Zayin, number 127. Hishasivan Losim Maaser Misema Ha'aris. The second, you can say this in terms of a sequence and order of givings, obligatory separations from your produce, is called Maaser. And Maaser, specifically from Sema Ha'aris, why does he say from the growth of the land? Not to confuse it with the Misvah that we already mentioned, which is Maaser Behema. So both Teruma and Maaser, that we'll explain in a moment, come from the growths of the land, but with Maaser, there's other types of Maaser as well. In any case, what's the source? V'chol Maasar Ha'aris Ladonai. So Ma'aseh literally means a tenth, and it is a tenth. It's actually 9.8% of your original produce, because once you've given 2% to the Kohen, then you have 98 parts left. 10% of that is 9.8%. And you give it to the Levi. The laws of Ma'aseh are not as stringent as the laws of Teruma, because the Israel can eat Ma'aseh if the Levi wants to give it back to him. But the Israel, on the serious violation, cannot eat Teruma. In any case, the Rambam is not going into detail with any of these Misvot. We know from the Torah that this goes to the Levi. This law also has its own Masechet. And Maaser Rishon. This is known, when you plainly say Ma'aser, we call it more specifically Ma'aser Rishon, the first Ma'aser, because as we're going to see, there's other forms of Ma'aser as well. Maaser Ani, Maaser Sheni. We'll talk about those. Again, this mitzvah is only in play in Eretz Yisrael, and it is even in play in our days, except, again, it does not go to the Levi in our days. Mitzvah Kov Kav Het, number 128. See, here it is, the other type of maaser. It's called maaser sheni, the second maaser, because in terms of the order of what you separate from your produce, this comes after maaser rishon. And when you say 10%, now it's only 10% of we'll talk about where it goes in a moment, but it's only 10% of what's left over. So it's not 10% of your original produce. In other words, what's left over after Terumah and Ma'aser Rishon. The source in the Torah, Aser Ta'aser, it says there, it's called Tubu'at Zar'echa, and Melamed, that teaches us She'en Ma'aserin Mashana L'Hebrata. So the Rambam will digress just for a moment, and this double language of Aser Ta'aser teaches us that you can't remove ma'aser from one year to the next. In other words, you can only cover your obligation of ma'aser with that year's produce. If I have a ma'aser obligation of year one on your calendar, and based on what was grown, let's say on year one, I can't wait till year two and use the produce that was grown on year two to cover my obligation for year one. Years cannot overlap. That's what the terminology aser ta'aser teaches us. So the Midrash asks, that's only maybe possibly with ma'aser sheni, because that's what in that context the Torah was talking about the mizvah ma'aser sheni when it said aser ta'aser. Minayim l'rabot she'ar ma'asrot. How do I know other givings also that I can't separate from one year to cover the previous year? The double terminology comes to include and teach more than just one maaser. So also maaser rishon, also terumah. You can't cover 1 year obligations with the next year's produce. And from the Torah, we know explicitly that the Misvot Ma'aser Sheni is to separate it, then bring it up to Yerushalayim, and then you, the owner, eat it. So this is not a giving. This is as opposed to Terumah Ma'aser that go to the Kohen and the Levi respectively. This is a Misvot separation, but it's not a Misvot giving. The owners eat Ma'aser Sheni. There's no, so to speak, loss. Ukvar kadam lanu zeh. And he said, he already mentioned this when he spoke about the mizvah of the Neta Reva'i, of the fourth year of the vineyard. He mentioned that Ma'aser Sheni is of the same breed that they brought to Yerushalayim. Im o efshar lehabi lerohak haderech. Im efshar lehabi. The Torah already specified to us and stipulated that if it's very difficult to bring based on your volume of produce, your ma'aser sheni, because of the distance that you live from Yerushalayim, you live in Meron, or you live in Elat, or you live far away. The Torah tells you, I can redeem it. I can bring its money, the currency with which I redeemed it, to the Beit HaMikdash, and there I can spend in Yerushalayim the money on food only, not on the other assets, on food, and there I eat in lieu of my Ma'aser Sheni. V'hu omro v'chirhak v'mecha makom etc. The other pasuk tells us when you are able to expand in Israel and you live in a distance and it's too much of a burden to bring it up, then you can employ that method of redemption. Also, Torah tells us that if you do opt to redeem Maaser Sheni, you have to add a fifth. And a fifth really literally means a fourth. It's a fifth after you add it. The sum total is a fifth. But we'll call it a 20% surcharge. It says actually there, it says when you redeem your maaser, the Torah says add the 20% surcharge. So this also has its own masechet, and said there's a ra'im called maaser sheni, who gam can eno choba ela lepirot eretz Yisrael min Torah, and also the misvah of maaser sheni is only from the produce of Israel. V'lo yochal zeh maaser lefnei habayit, and also he says this can only be eaten. There's only such thing as eating the maaser sheni separation during the time of the Bet Hamikdash. For the Shon Sefer machish achilat bechol maaser sheni. The Midrash compares, because of the proximity of these misvot, the standards of Bechor, the bringing the korban of Bechor, and the misvah maaser sheni ma Bechor eno ne'achal b'nei habayit, kach maaser sheni eno ne'achal b'nei habayit. Just like the Bechor, an owner can only eat it, let's say when it becomes a mum, can only be blemished, can only be eat it during the time of the Bet HaMikdash existence. So to Maaser Sheni is only a Bet HaMikdash related misvah. Okay, we'll end here. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.